Darkness hung heavy over the Pacific waters on that fateful June morning in 1942. Young Japanese aviators sat cramped in their cockpits across four massive aircraft carriers. The salt air filled their lungs as they breathed deeply. Some checked their instruments one final time. Others whispered silent prayers. Below deck, more pilots crowded into ready rooms. Maps covered every available surface. Target photographs were passed from hand to hand. Each man studied the details with intense concentration. Their destination lay ahead somewhere in the vast blue expanse. Meanwhile, mechanics and deck crews swarmed over aircraft like busy ants. Wrenches turned. Fuel lines connected. Ammunition loaded into magazines. Every rivet had to be perfect. Every engine had to purr like a contented cat. These machines would soon write their names in history. But fate had already begun weaving its cruel pattern. Far to the northeast, exactly 240 miles away, three American carriers cut through the swells. Their own crews prepared for battle. Launch operations were beginning. The wind whipped across their flight decks. The Japanese had no idea their enemies were so close. No reconnaissance had spotted the American ships. No radio intercepts had warned of their presence. The element of surprise that Japan counted on had already slipped through their fingers like water. What should have been the Empire's greatest triumph would become its most devastating defeat. The plan called for eliminating American carrier power forever. Instead, within hours, four Japanese carriers would disappear beneath the waves. Ships that had struck Pearl Harbor with such devastating effect would become tombs. Over 3,000 irreplaceable airmen and sailors would perish with them. This marked the end of 6 months of unbroken victories. Now, for the first time, this pivotal confrontation would be seen through Japanese eyes. The admirals who conceived the strategy, the pilots who flew the missions, the sailors who fought and died. This was Midway. Spring had arrived in Tokyo 2 months before the coming disaster. Inside the naval headquarters, heated arguments raged behind closed doors. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto commanded the entire combined fleet. His voice carried weight throughout the Imperial Navy. But even he faced fierce opposition from the Naval General Staff. The situation was far more precarious than the Japanese public realized. The December attack on Pearl Harbor had achieved tactical brilliance. Battleships burned. Aircraft lay twisted on airfields. The American Pacific Fleet appeared crippled. Yet one critical failure haunted every Japanese naval officer. Not a single American aircraft carrier had been destroyed. This fact gnawed at Yamamoto's mind day and night. The USS Enterprise and USS Lexington had been far from Pearl Harbor when the attack came. Both ships still prowled the Pacific waters. Both continued striking at Japanese forces wherever opportunity arose. Even worse humiliation had followed in April. American bombers had appeared over Tokyo itself. The sight of B-25s thundering through Japanese skies created shock waves throughout the military hierarchy. These planes had launched from the carrier USS Hornet in what became known as the Doolittle Raid. The physical damage was minimal. A few buildings burned, some civilians died, but the psychological impact shattered Japanese confidence like a hammer blow. The homeland lay exposed. The emperor himself faced potential danger. Someone had to accept responsibility for this unthinkable breach. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo felt the pressure most acutely. He had led the Pearl Harbor strike with great success. Yet critics blamed him for failing to launch a third wave of attacks. Others questioned why he hadn't located the missing American carriers. Now Tokyo itself bore bomb scars under his watch. Political pressure for decisive action grew stronger each day, but Japanese leadership remained deeply fractured over strategy. Within the marble corridors of power, two competing visions emerged for continuing the war. The Naval General Staff represented conservative thinking. These officers preferred consolidating existing gains rather than risking everything on one massive gamble. They advocated a southern strategy focusing on the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. Cutting supply lines between America and Australia made perfect sense to their cautious minds, but Yamamoto possessed a different vision entirely. His strategy emerged from both golden opportunity and growing desperation. He understood something that few other Japanese leaders truly grasped. Time was racing against them like an enemy destroyer. His years in America had opened his eyes to industrial realities. At Harvard University, he had studied among future American leaders. As a naval attaché, he had toured factories and shipyards. He had witnessed the massive steel mills of Pittsburgh belching smoke and flame. The shipyards at Newport News stretched beyond the horizon. Endless farmlands could feed millions of workers laboring around the clock. Once America's war production reached full capacity, Japan would face overwhelming material superiority. Numbers alone would crush the empire's ambitions. Quality could not triumph indefinitely against such massive quantity. Yamamoto had expressed this concern clearly in documented conversations with government leaders. Speaking to Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe in 1940, he had warned about time limitations. If ordered to fight America, he could guarantee aggressive action for 6 months. Beyond that time frame, he held no confidence whatsoever. Events would prove this prediction perfectly accurate. Another verified statement from September 1941 revealed his deeper fears. Japan would initially expand in every direction like an octopus spreading its tentacles. This success would last perhaps 18 months at most. Then American industrial might would overwhelm them completely. Yamamoto's solution was Operation MI. The target was Midway Atoll. These tiny islands covered just 6 square miles of coral and sand. Their strategic importance far exceeded their microscopic size. Midway sat 100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. The islands served as America's westernmost outpost in the Pacific. Submarines refueled there before continuing their patrols. Aircraft used the airfield for staging operations throughout the Central Pacific region. But Yamamoto saw Midway's true value as irresistible bait. American forces would never abandon such a crucial position without a fight. When they came rushing to defend the atoll, superior Japanese forces would destroy them in decisive battle. This would be the Kantai Kessen that naval doctrine had always envisioned. The operational plan grew incredibly complex, perhaps too complex for successful execution. Multiple forces would operate across thousands of miles of empty ocean. Coordination would require perfect timing and flawless communication. An invasion fleet would capture Midway's airfield and facilities. A carrier strike force would destroy American air power on the islands. The main body included battleships led by Yamamoto's flagship, the mighty Yamato. Even a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands would confuse American commanders. Over 200 ships comprised this armada. Japan had never assembled such a massive fleet for any operation. The written orders alone filled 700 pages of detailed instructions. These documents reached subordinate commanders just days before departure. Officers barely had time to study the complex coordination requirements. Opposition to the plan existed throughout the naval hierarchy, but resistance proved ultimately futile against Yamamoto's determination. Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki served as Yamamoto's chief of staff. He conducted war games in early May to test the operation's feasibility. The results proved deeply disturbing. During tabletop exercises, American carriers appeared much earlier than Japanese planners expected. These ships inflicted serious damage on the attacking Japanese fleet. Several carriers took hits that would cripple their operations. The simulation suggested significant problems with the current strategy. But these inconvenient results were simply overruled by senior officers. The umpires arbitrarily reduced American hits on Japanese ships. Vessels that had been sunk in the exercise were reflated and returned to action. Reality was adjusted to match desired outcomes rather than probable results. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda had designed the brilliant Pearl Harbor attack plan. His tactical genius was recognized throughout the Imperial Navy. When he expressed serious concerns about Midway's operational complexity, his warnings were dismissed. The vulnerability of carriers operating so far from friendly bases troubled him deeply. But victory disease had infected even the most brilliant minds. Overconfidence born from 6 months of easy conquests clouded Japanese judgment. Intelligence reports suggested they had sunk 2 American carriers at Coral Sea in May. Actually, only the USS Lexington had been destroyed. The USS Yorktown had suffered significant damage but remained operational. Japanese analysts assumed Yorktown would need months of major repairs. They failed to detect the frantic work at Pearl Harbor. Over 1,400 skilled workers labored around the clock for 3 straight days. This repair effort was beyond anything Japanese shipyards could accomplish. Their calculations suggested Americans could field at most 2 operational carriers for the coming battle. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the carrier strike force despite harboring deep personal doubts. He was not a carrier admiral by training or natural temperament. His expertise lay with torpedoes and surface warfare. Appointment to command the First Air Fleet came through seniority rather than specialized knowledge. Naval aviation remained foreign territory for his conservative mind. At Pearl Harbor, excessive caution had prevented a third strike wave. That attack might have destroyed American fuel depots and repair facilities completely. Now he faced an even more complex operation with increasingly exhausted forces. His carriers had been at sea almost continuously since Pearl Harbor's success. They had struck Darwin with devastating effect. Ceylon had felt their wrath. Operations extended from the Indian Ocean to the Coral Sea without respite. Air crews were physically and mentally exhausted. The ships desperately needed maintenance and resupply. Most troubling was the recent Battle of the Coral Sea's cost. While tactically a Japanese victory with Lexington sinking, strategically it created serious problems. The carrier Shokaku had suffered severe damage requiring months of repair work. Her sister ship Zuikaku had lost so many aircraft and experienced pilots that she couldn't participate in the Midway operation. 2 of Japan's finest carriers would be absent from the decisive confrontation. Nagumo confided his concerns to Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka, his chief of staff. They were being asked to accomplish too much with insufficient resources. The Americans had gained valuable time to prepare their defenses. Japanese pilots showed signs of combat fatigue. Most critically, nobody knew the current location of American carrier forces. Yamamoto was gambling with the Empire's entire future on incomplete intelligence and wishful thinking. But the most fatal flaw in Japanese planning involved intelligence failures and dangerous assumptions. Unknown to Imperial Navy leaders, American codebreakers had penetrated their most secret communications. Commander Joseph Rochefort's station Hypo at Pearl Harbor had been reading Japanese naval messages since early 1942. The Americans knew about Operation MI in advance. They knew Midway was the primary target. A clever deception confirmed this intelligence when Midway broadcast false reports of water shortage problems via secure cable. Japanese intercepts subsequently mentioned that AF was experiencing water difficulties. AF was the Japanese code designation for Midway Atoll. Admiral Chester Nimitz possessed complete knowledge of Japanese force dispositions. He could position his own ships for maximum advantage. The submarine cordon meant to detect American vessels leaving Pearl Harbor would arrive at their stations too late. American carriers had already passed through undetected. A planned reconnaissance flight over Pearl Harbor called Operation K was canceled when complications arose. Submarine I-123 discovered American warships USS Thornton and USS Preble occupying French frigate shoals. This was the intended refueling point for long-range flying boats. The same tactic had worked perfectly in March when 2 Kawanishi H-8K aircraft had bombed Oahu after refueling from submarines. but Nimitz had learned from that earlier raid and positioned ships to prevent its repetition. One by one, the intelligence-gathering systems that might have warned of the American ambush were being systematically blinded. Radio intercepts did indicate increased American submarine activity around Midway. Message traffic suggested heightened alert status. The ease with which Americans had located Japanese forces at Coral Sea hinted that communication codes might be compromised. But these warning signs were dismissed with typical overconfidence. As one staff officer arrogantly declared, Americans were too intellectually inferior to break sophisticated Japanese codes. They were also too cowardly to fight unless they possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. They would only approach Midway after Japanese forces had captured it. Then they would be destroyed at Japan's convenience. May 27th marked the anniversary of Admiral Togo's legendary victory over the Russian fleet at Tsushima. On this auspicious date, Nagumo's carrier strike force departed from the inland sea. The Kido Butai represented the finest naval aviation force ever assembled. 4 magnificent carriers led the formation. Akagi, meaning Red Castle, had been Yamamoto's former command and now served as Nagumo's flagship. Kaga, translated as Increased Joy, was the massive converted battleship. Hiryu meant Flying Dragon. Soryu was known as Green Dragon. Together, these ships carried 248 aircraft, including 21 Zeros being ferried to Midway as reinforcements. This left 225 operational machines available for combat operations. Their pilots were the most experienced naval aviators anywhere in the world. These were the same ships and men who had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. They had rampaged from Hawaii to Ceylon without suffering serious defeat. Surely nothing could stop such a formidable force. Commander Minoru Genda still recovered from emergency appendectomy surgery. Despite his weakened condition, he served as Nagumo's air operations officer. His tactical expertise was desperately needed for the complex operation ahead. Before departure, Genda made a final entry in his personal diary. His words reflected growing unease about the entire operation. The planning had been rushed beyond reasonable limits. Intelligence about American capabilities remained poor and unreliable. The operational plan was far too complex for reliable execution under combat conditions. But they were samurai bound by duty and honor. They would fulfill their obligations, even if the path led to death and destruction. He prayed that the gods would protect Japan because he feared they were sailing toward inevitable catastrophe. The fatal flaw of overconfidence was perfectly exemplified by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida's situation. He had led the Pearl Harbor attack with brilliant success. His tactical leadership and flying skills were legendary throughout the Imperial Navy. But in late May, he underwent emergency appendectomy surgery aboard Akagi. The operation left him too weak to fly combat missions. This deprived the Japanese of their most experienced strike leader at the most critical moment imaginable. According to later testimony from other officers, Fuchida watched the battle preparations from his sick bed with mounting anxiety. Everything about this operation felt fundamentally wrong. The timing seemed rushed. The plan appeared flawed. Even the very atmosphere felt heavy with approaching doom. However, modern historians note that Fuchida's post-war accounts must be treated with appropriate caution. Contemporary scholarship has challenged many of his dramatic claims about events and conversations. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 3rd, far to the north, the Aleutian Islands operation commenced. Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta's second carrier strike force included the light carriers Ryujo and Junyo. They launched strikes against Dutch Harbor in Alaska as planned. This attack was designed as the Great Strategic Deception. American forces would rush northward to counter the Aleutian threat. Meanwhile, Nagumo would strike Midway with complete tactical surprise. The elaborate plan would achieve total victory through misdirection and superior timing. But the deception had already failed completely. American codebreakers had revealed the true target to Admiral Nimitz. His carriers remained positioned near Midway, rather than racing toward Alaska. The intricate deception had deceived nobody except the Japanese planners themselves. Nagumo's carriers steamed through patches of fog toward their designated launch point. Strict radio silence prevented any coordination between the widely separated task forces. This communication blackout would prove catastrophic as events unfolded rapidly. In ready rooms throughout the fleet, pilots received their final mission briefings. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga would lead the first strike against Midway's installations. He studied reconnaissance photographs of the target one last time before takeoff. The images were several weeks old, but showed essential details clearly. Airfield runways stretched across the tiny island. Fuel storage tanks clustered near the flight line. Defensive positions ringed the perimeter. But these outdated photographs failed to reveal recent reinforcement efforts. Additional fighter aircraft had arrived. New bombers crowded the airfield. Most critically, a radar installation would detect the approaching Japanese strike while still 93 miles away. That evening, American PBY Catalina flying boats spotted portions of the Japanese invasion fleet. They were 700 miles west of Midway and heading steadily eastward. This first contact electrified the American command structure throughout the Pacific. Navy pilot Ensign Jack Reed, flying a PBY, transmitted the crucial sighting report. At 09:15 hours, he reported the main body bearing 262 degrees at 700 miles distance. But Nagumo's carriers remained hidden by distance and weather conditions. The most dangerous Japanese ships continued approaching undetected. On Akagi's bridge, tension filled the air like smoke. Chief of Staff Kusaka approached Admiral Nagumo with obvious concern. If Americans had spotted the invasion force, they might be far more alert than original planning had assumed. The element of surprise could already be compromised. Nagumo dismissed these worries with characteristic confidence. The invasion force was supposed to be detected according to the operational plan. American attention would focus on that obvious threat. Tomorrow would bring the destruction of Midway's air power through overwhelming force. When American carriers finally arrived to mount their desperate counterattack, superior Japanese forces would be waiting in perfect position. But even as Nagumo spoke these confident words, American Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard USS Enterprise was plotting probable Japanese carrier positions. His calculations placed them exactly where intelligence suggested they would be. The American carriers had reached their designated positions undetected by any Japanese reconnaissance efforts. Task Force 16 under Spruance included Enterprise and Hornet with their full complement of aircraft. Task Force 17 under Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher included the hastily repaired Yorktown. All three carriers had reached Point Luck, their secret rendezvous northeast of Midway, without Japanese detection. Weather conditions were absolutely perfect for flight operations. Clear skies stretched to every horizon. Calm seas provided stable platforms for takeoff and landing. Visibility extended for many miles in all directions. Nature itself seemed to favor the coming confrontation. At precisely 04:30 hours, Akagi and Kaga began launching the first wave against Midway's defenders. The launch proceeded with mechanical precision that reflected months of constant practice. 36 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers rolled down the flight deck. 36 Nakajima B-5N Kate level bombers followed in perfect sequence. 36 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters provided escort protection. Lieutenant Tomonaga led this formation of 108 aircraft into the lightning sky. They circled once over the fleet in traditional salute before heading southeast toward their target 240 miles distant. As the strike aircraft formed up and departed, Admiral Nagumo made his first fateful decision of this crucial day. Despite naval doctrine calling for maximum striking power, he held back half his remaining aircraft. 108 planes stayed aboard the carriers. Kate torpedo bombers were armed with Type 91 torpedoes and 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs. They would be available if American ships suddenly appeared. The decision seemed prudent and tactically sound. But it would prove absolutely catastrophic within a few short hours. Below decks in Akagi's hangar, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida watched the launch from his sickbed. He was still recovering from the appendectomy that prevented him from leading this crucial strike. His absence would be keenly felt as events unfolded. According to witness accounts from other officers, Fuchida expressed serious concerns about the entire operation. However, his specific words remain unverified in contemporary historical documents. Modern scholarship questions many of his dramatic post-war claims. At 0500 hours, Nagumo launched his reconnaissance aircraft. Only 7 planes were assigned to search the vast expanse of ocean around the fleet. By contrast, American forces had deployed over 30 PBY Catalinas in their search patterns. This disparity in intelligence gathering would prove decisive. Most critically, the search plane from heavy cruiser tone designated as Number 4 Scout was assigned to search the exact sector where American carriers were actually positioned. But this aircraft launched 30 minutes behind schedule. Various sources attribute the delay to catapult mechanical problems. Others suggest engine trouble or administrative delays caused the critical timing failure. This single mechanical malfunction would cascade into complete catastrophe for the Japanese fleet. Ironically, recent scholarship suggests that even if the plane had launched on schedule, its designated search pattern might have missed the American task forces entirely. At 0534 hours, PBY pilot Lieutenant Howard 80 spotted the Japanese carriers cutting through the Pacific swells. His electrifying message reached American commanders throughout the region. Enemy carriers sighted bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles, course 135, speed 25 knots. On Enterprise, Admiral Spruance made a command decision that would determine the battle's ultimate outcome. Despite the extreme range of nearly 200 miles, he ordered an immediate full strike. His aircraft would have barely enough fuel to return safely, but he wanted to catch the Japanese when they were most vulnerable during recovery operations of their midway strike. At 0553 hours, radar operators on Midway detected the incoming Japanese strike. The formation was still 93 miles away, but approaching rapidly. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll with urgent warning. Every available aircraft was scrambled immediately. Bombers launched to attack the Japanese fleet wherever it might be found. Fighters climbed desperately to defend the island's installations. 20 Marine fighters took to the air in a hopeless attempt to stop the incoming assault. They included 20 obsolete Brewster F-2A Buffalo aircraft and 7 Grumman F-4F Wildcats. The defenders were outnumbered 4-1 by escorting 0 fighters. The interception occurred at 0616 hours high above the Pacific waters. Marine Major Floyd Parks led the gallant but doomed defensive formation. His final radio transmission echoed across the airwaves. Hawks at Angels 14, supported by fighters. The massacre that followed was swift and utterly brutal. The Zeros, with their superior maneuverability and experienced pilots, tore through the Marine formation like sharks through schooling fish. Within minutes, 13 Marine fighters had been shot down. 4 others suffered severe damage that would prevent further combat. Major Parks was among the dead heroes who gave their lives defending American territory. The Zero fighters lost only 3 aircraft in this one-sided aerial combat. The sky belonged entirely to Japan as the strike force continued toward its target. The morning sky burned orange as Tomonaga's strike force swept toward Midway. Clock hands pointed to 0630. Below them, the island waited like a target painted on blue canvas. Dive bombers screamed down first. Their engines howled through thin air. Wings cut sharp angles against clouds. Behind them came level bombers, flying straight and steady. Explosions bloomed across the airfield. Fuel tanks erupted in towering flames. Orange fire licked at storage buildings. Concrete cracked under the assault. The runway split and cratered. But something was wrong. Tominaga circled his aircraft above the smoke. His eyes scanned the damaged base below. Through drifting black clouds, he saw movement. Aircraft were still rising from the supposedly destroyed field. The runway showed damage. Chunks of concrete lay scattered. Deep holes pocked the surface, but planes kept taking off. They climbed steadily into morning air. Most disturbing of all was the emptiness. No American aircraft sat burning on the ground. The hangars stood hollow. The parking areas were bare. Every plane had been launched before the attack arrived. They had escaped the trap. At 0700, Tominaga's radio crackled to life. His voice carried urgency across the static. "Need second attack wave." The message reached Nagumo just as the first American counterattack began. 6 TBF Avengers appeared on the horizon. 4 B-26 Marauders followed close behind. All carried torpedoes slung beneath their bellies. The weapons gleamed silver in morning light. 0 fighters rose to meet them. Engines screamed as they climbed. The combat air patrols swarmed like angry wasps. Guns chattered across empty sky. 5 Avengers fell in flames. 2 B-26s exploded in mid-air. Debris scattered across blue water. But 1 B-26 kept coming. Her name was Susie Q. Lieutenant James Murray gripped her controls. His knuckles showed white against black steering wheel. Sweat dripped down his forehead. Behind him, his torpedo dropped away. The weapon hit water and ran straight. But Murray wasn't done. He aimed his bomber directly at the carrier deck. Japanese witnesses watched in horror. The B-26 roared down the length of the flight deck. Her machine guns fired continuously. Bullets sparked off metal surfaces. 2 sailors crumpled to the deck. Blood spread beneath their bodies. The bomber's shadow passed over them like death itself. At the last possible moment, Susie Q pulled up. Her engines strained against gravity. Wings flexed under impossible stress. The plane barely cleared the bridge structure. On the bridge, Admiral Nagumo ducked low. His staff threw themselves to the deck. The bomber's belly passed inches over their heads. Wind from her propellers ruffled their uniforms. Murray's aircraft had taken over 500 bullet holes. Hydraulic fluid leaked in red streams. Control cables hung by single strands. But somehow she stayed airborne. Somehow she made it back to Midway. A second B-26 wasn't so fortunate. Lieutenant Herbert Mays fought his controls as his plane burned. Smoke poured from her engines. Flames licked at her wings. The bomber crashed into the ocean near the carrier's bridge. Some witnesses believed Mays had tried a deliberate ramming attack. Water erupted skyward. Steam hissed where hot metal met cold sea. This near miss shook everyone watching. Captain Kusaka would later testify about the moment. The admiral was visibly shaken. To have an enemy plane nearly crash into the bridge. It was as if the war god had given us a warning. More American attacks followed like waves against rocks. 16 Marine dive bombers appeared next. Major Lofton Henderson led them through flak bursts. Black smoke flowers bloomed around his formation. Henderson would die leading his squadron. His plane took direct hits. Fire consumed his cockpit. He never pulled out of his final dive. 15 B-17 bombers came next, flying at high altitude. Their bomb bay doors opened like hungry mouths. 11 Marine Vindicators followed. These older planes struggled to keep formation. Their engines coughed and strained. But their pilots held course through defensive fire. All attacks were repulsed. Heavy losses marked each attempt. No bombs found their targets. But the constant pressure achieved something more valuable. The Japanese carriers dodged and weaved continuously. Violent turns threw men against bulkheads. Flight operations became impossible. Planes couldn't launch, others couldn't land. At 07:15, Admiral Nagumo faced his most critical decision. His reserve aircraft waited below decks. They carried armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes. These weapons were meant for ship attacks. But Tominaga needed support at Midway. No enemy carriers had been spotted. The admiral's staff gathered around plotting tables. Heated discussion filled the bridge. Voices rose in argument. Some officers pointed at charts. Others gestured toward the horizon. Maps crinkled under nervous hands. Finally, Nagumo made his choice. The order would seal his fate. Remove torpedoes, load land attack bombs. This violated Yamamoto's explicit orders. The commander-in-chief had insisted on readiness for anti-ship operations, but no carriers had been detected. The immediate threat came from Midway's land-based planes. Down in the hangar decks, chaos erupted instantly. Ordnance crews began the laborious process. Type 91 torpedoes came off their racks. 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs were unloaded. Smaller land attack munitions replaced them. High explosive bombs meant for buildings and runways. Incendiary weapons designed to start fires. Against all regulations and safety protocols, the removed torpedoes were stacked in hangar spaces. They should have been returned to magazines far below, but there wasn't time. Bombs piled near aircraft. Fuel hoses snaked everywhere as planes were refueled. Aviation gasoline fumes filled enclosed spaces. One spark would kill everyone. Airman Mori worked among the chaos. He would later testify if he had survived. The hangar deck looked like a bomb factory. One spark and we would all be dead. At 0728, everything changed in an instant. The delayed scout plane from Cruiser Tone finally reported. Scout plane number 4 had been late launching due to catapult problems. His voice crackled over radio waves. Sight 10 enemy surface ships, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. Nagumo immediately signaled back. Ascertain ship types. The response didn't come. Minutes crawled by like hours. Meanwhile, the rearming continued below. Hangar decks became increasingly cluttered with ordnance. Torpedoes leaned against bulkheads. Bombs sat exposed on deck plates. Fuel vapors grew thicker. At 0745, another American strike arrived from Midway. 16 Marine dive bombers from VMS B-241 swept in low. Major Henderson led them through defensive fire. The Zeros savaged the formation immediately. 8 bombers fell in flames. Wreckage scattered across ocean swells. But the attacks kept coming. The constant pressure forced violent evasive maneuvers. Carriers heeled over in sharp turns. Men grabbed handholds as decks tilted. Flight operations remained impossible. Nagumo found himself trapped in an impossible position. His fighters were running low on fuel and ammunition. Hours of continuous combat had drained their resources. Tomonaga's strike force would return soon from Midway. They would also be low on fuel. Landing operations couldn't be delayed much longer. His decks were spotted with aircraft being rearmed. The process was only half complete. Some planes carried bombs. Others carried torpedoes. Many carried nothing at all. Somewhere out there were American surface ships, possibly carriers. The threat level remained unknown. At 0809, Scout Plane Number 4 finally clarified his earlier report. Enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Nagumo breathed a sigh of relief. No carriers had been mentioned. He continued rearming for the second Midway strike. Victory still seemed within reach. The American land-based attacks had been repulsed with heavy losses. But at 0820, another message shattered his composure completely. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi commanded the 2nd Carrier Division from Hiryu. His ship sailed several miles from the main formation. At 0830, his signal reached Nagumo. Consider it advisable to launch attack force immediately. Yamaguchi was aggressive and decisive. He saw the danger more clearly than others. Every minute of delay increased their vulnerability. Speed was everything now. But Nagumo hesitated. His aircraft were in complete chaos. Some were armed with bombs for land attack. Others carried torpedoes for ships. Many weren't armed at all. His fighters desperately needed to land and refuel. Combat had drained their tanks nearly dry. Ammunition was also running low after hours of fighting. Tomonaga's returning strike was approaching the carriers. They had to land soon or crash into the sea. Fuel gauges showed red across the formation. To launch now would mean a partial, uncoordinated attack. No fighter escort would be available. This violated every principle of Japanese carrier doctrine. Commander Minoru Genda was consulted despite his illness. Recent appendectomy had left him weak and pale. According to staff officer testimonies, he argued for immediate launch. "Speed is everything now. Launch what we have." But Captain Kusaka counseled caution. His voice was steady and measured. "If we attack piecemeal, we'll suffer heavy losses for little gain. Better to recover our aircraft. Properly arm them. Then launch a fully constituted strike according to doctrine." Nagumo, always cautious, always following proper procedure, sided with Kusaka. The decision seemed logical and prudent. It was also completely wrong. "We will recover Tomonaga's force, rearm and refuel properly, then strike with full strength." He signaled all carriers with his decision. "After completing recovery of aircraft, we shall proceed north to engage the enemy." This decision sealed the fate of the Kido Butai. As Tomonaga's planes began landing at 837, the situation grew more desperate. Aircraft were struck below to be refueled and rearmed. The hangar decks became death traps. Fuel lines spread everywhere like veins. Bombs and torpedoes were scattered about carelessly. The constant cycling of elevators brought planes up and down. Safety protocols were completely abandoned. The rush to prepare for launch overrode all caution. No one had time to notice the first American torpedo planes appearing on the horizon. At 0920, the first American carrier planes arrived over the Japanese fleet. 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 appeared low on the water. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led VT-8 without fighter escort. They flew obsolete aircraft at just 100 knots. The planes barely skimmed above rolling swells. They bore in against the entire Japanese fleet. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from every ship. Black bursts filled the sky. Tracer bullets drew red lines through blue air. The Zeros on combat air patrol finally had worthy targets. After hours of fighting off land-based attacks, they descended like hawks on pigeons. The massacre was total and swift. One by one, the slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers were shot down. Flames consumed cockpits. Wings folded and twisted. Men screamed as they died. All 15 Devastators were destroyed. Of 30 aircrew, only one survived. Ensign George Gay floated in the water afterward. He hid under his seat cushion and watched the rest of the battle unfold. Not a single torpedo found its target. But Waldron's sacrifice was not in vain. The Zeros were all drawn down to sea level. Every fighter focused on the torpedo planes. At 0954, 14 more Devastators from Enterprise's VT-6 arrived. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led them through the same gauntlet. Again, the Zeros swarmed down like angry insects. 10 were shot down in minutes. Burning wreckage dotted the ocean surface. Only 4 escaped. Still no torpedo hits registered on any Japanese ship. At 10:12, Devastators from Yorktown's VT-3 attacked next. Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey led 12 planes into the same slaughter. 10 more were shot down. Of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese fleet, only 6 survived. It seemed like another massacre for nothing. American blood stained Pacific waters. On the bridge of carrier Akagi, there was relief and celebration. The American attacks had been repulsed with terrible losses. Victory seemed certain now. Nagumo ordered the strike force to prepare for launch at 10:30. His aircraft were nearly ready. Revenge would be swift and complete. But high above the celebrating Japanese, unnoticed and undetected, 2 groups of SBD Dauntless dive bombers arrived simultaneously. With every Zero fighter at sea level, the sky above was empty. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 33 dive bombers from Enterprise. He had searched beyond his calculated interception point. Fuel gauges showed red, but he gambled everything to find the Japanese. He had spotted the destroyer Arashi speeding north at high speed. The ship had been depth-charging submarine USS Nautilus. McCluskey followed her course directly to the Kido Butai. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's 17 dive bombers from Yorktown arrived from a different direction. They appeared at the same moment as McCluskey's formation. At 10:20, lookouts on Akagi screamed warnings. "Hell divers!" But it was far too late to matter. With the Zeros at sea level, with the decks packed with fueled and armed aircraft, with bombs and torpedoes scattered throughout hangar spaces, the Japanese carriers were perfectly vulnerable. At 10:22, McCluskey pushed over into his dive from 14,500 feet. Behind him, his squadrons rolled into attack dives. The rising sun insignia on carrier decks below grew larger. Perfect targets in the crystalline Pacific morning air. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey led his bombers against Kaga. Lieutenant Richard Best took his division against Akagi. Almost simultaneously, Leslie's Yorktown bombers plunged toward Soryu. The Japanese carriers were recovering from violent evasive maneuvers. Their decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled. They were caught at their most vulnerable moment possible. On Kaga, 4 bombs struck in rapid succession. The first 1,000-pound bomb exploded near the bridge at 10:22. Captain Jisaku Okada died instantly. Most of his command staff perished with him. The second bomb struck the flight deck amidships. It penetrated to the hangar deck below. Fueled aircraft exploded in chain reactions. Fire spread like liquid death. The third and fourth bombs turned the ship into an inferno. Within minutes, Kaga was a floating torch. Ammunition cooked off continuously. Aviation fuel created walls of flame. Akagi took just one direct hit at 10:24. Lieutenant Best's bomb was enough. The 1,000-pound weapon penetrated the flight deck easily. It exploded in the upper hangar among 18 aircraft. These planes were being refueled and rearmed simultaneously. The induced explosions of improperly stored ordnance were catastrophic beyond imagination. Torpedoes detonated like thunder. Bombs exploded in sympathetic detonations. Aviation fuel created an unstoppable conflagration that consumed everything. Bridge personnel reported that within 2 minutes, the entire hangar deck was an inferno. Temperatures exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius. Steel plates glowed cherry red. Paint bubbled and burned. Men died instantly in superheated air. Soryu suffered 3 direct hits in her hangar spaces at 10:25. Lieutenant Leslie's bombers placed their ordnance with deadly precision. Explosions tore through her vitals. 13 Valdive bombers, 3 Zero fighters, and 4 Kate torpedo bombers on the flight deck were blown apart. Below in the hangars, the stacked torpedoes and bombs created secondary explosions. These blasts tore through the ship's vital systems. Her captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, refused to leave his burning ship. According to testimony of Chief Petty Officer Abe, who was sent to rescue him, the captain was last seen on the bridge. Yanagimoto stood with sword in hand. He was singing the national anthem, Kimigayo, as flames engulfed the command structure. His voice carried over the roar of fire. Only Hiryu, separated from the others by several miles and screened by clouds, escaped the devastation. Admiral Yamaguchi immediately prepared a counterattack, but 3/4 of Japan's carrier striking power had been eliminated in 5 minutes. At 10:58, even as the 3 carriers burned out of control, Yamaguchi launched 18 Valdive bombers and 6 Zero fighters. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led them toward the enemy. Following the American plane's return track, they found Yorktown at 1200. Despite fierce resistance from Wildcat fighters and anti-aircraft fire, they scored 3 bomb hits. The American carrier was left dead in the water. She burned and listed heavily to port. Damage control parties worked frantically to save their ship. Incredibly, within 2 hours, Yorktown was underway again. She made 20 knots through blue water. Her crew had performed miracles of seamanship and engineering. Yamaguchi, aggressive to the very end, immediately prepared a second strike. At 1331, only 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters were available. Lieutenant Tominaga would lead them. During the morning midway strike, Tominaga's left-wing fuel tank had been damaged by anti-aircraft fire. Maintenance crews only had time to fuel his right tank. He was offered a chance to switch planes with another pilot. Tominaga refused the offer firmly. "Every aircraft is needed," he stated simply. He knew it was a one-way mission. His fuel would only last for the attack run. There wouldn't be enough for the return flight. At 1430, Tominaga's small force found Yorktown making 19 knots after heroic damage control efforts. American fighters tore into the formation immediately. Guns chattered across empty sky. Tominaga held his course despite his plane catching fire from fighter attacks. According to American witnesses, his burning aircraft maintained its torpedo run until the very last moment. He released his torpedo before crashing into the sea. Flames consumed his cockpit as he died. 2 torpedoes hit Yorktown at 1445. They tore open her port side below the waterline. The carrier developed a 26-degree list. This time, the damage was fatal. She would not survive. But at 1700, 24 dive bombers from Enterprise found Soryu. 4 bombs turned her into another inferno at 1703. The last Japanese carrier was doomed. Yamaguchi assembled his crew on the tilting flight deck. According to survivors, he apologized for the defeat. He urged them to survive and rebuild a stronger navy. Then he retired to his bridge with Captain Tomeo Kaku. Both men chose to go down with their ship. Their bodies were never recovered from the deep. Yamaguchi's final message to Nagumo included an apology for the defeat. He expressed hope for the emperor's fortune in war. He was posthumously promoted to vice admiral. Through the night of June 4th to 5th, surviving Japanese ships attempted damage control. Engineers worked frantically to save their carriers, but it was hopeless. Soryu sank at 1913 on June 4th with 701 men. She rolled over and disappeared beneath dark waters. Kaga followed at 1925, taking 801 sailors to the bottom. At Oro 200 on June 5th, Yamamoto finally accepted reality. He was still 600 miles away aboard flagship Yamato with the main body that never engaged. His signal was brief and final. "Occupation of Midway is cancelled. Withdraw." Akagi proved surprisingly hard to kill despite the raging fires. She remained afloat through the entire night. Her hull was tough and well-built. At 0500 on June 5th, after all survivors were evacuated, Japanese destroyers fired 4 torpedoes into her. She finally sank, taking 267 men with her. Soryu also refused to die easily. She burned through the night like a torch on black water. She was scuttled at 0510 after burning for hours. She took 392 sailors and both her admirals into the deep Pacific. As the sun rose on June 5th, the cream of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force lay on the bottom. The Pacific Ocean was over 17,000 feet deep at this location. With the ships went 3,057 men. Of these, 2,181 died on the carriers themselves. Akagi lost 267 men. Kaga lost 811. Soryu lost 392. Soryu lost 711. Another 792 died on heavy cruisers when Mikuma was sunk with 700 dead. Mogami was damaged with 92 dead after they collided during night operations. American aircraft caught them the next day. Crucially, only 110 of the dead were aircrew. Most pilots were rescued from the water. The greater irreplaceable loss was over 700 skilled aircraft mechanics. Flight deck personnel whose expertise had taken years to develop were gone forever. These men couldn't be quickly replaced. Their knowledge died with them. The survivors picked up by destroyers were immediately segregated from the rest of the fleet. Orders prevented news of the disaster from spreading through the ships. They were confined below decks and forbidden to communicate with anyone. The cover-up began before the battle was even over. The disaster wasn't quite finished yet. On June 6th, submarine I-168 found opportunity for revenge. Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe commanded the boat. He had been stationed off Midway providing weather reports. Tanabe had watched the morning attacks through his periscope. Now he found the crippled Yorktown under tow. USS Vireo was pulling the damaged carrier toward Pearl Harbor. Destroyer screens protected both ships, but Tanabe slipped through at 3 knots. He achieved what the entire Kido Butai could not accomplish. At 13:31, Tanabe fired a spread of 4 torpedoes from 1,200 yards. 2 torpedoes hit Yorktown in her port side. 1 torpedo hit destroyer Hammond alongside, providing auxiliary power to the carrier. Hammond broke in 2 and sank in 4 minutes. 80 men died, many killed by her own depth charges exploding as she went down. Yorktown, hit by 2 more torpedoes, was finally doomed. But she refused to sink immediately. The tough carrier fought death for hours. She finally rolled over and sank at 07:01 on June 7th. The ocean was approximately 16,650 feet deep at that location. This small consolation, sinking the carrier that had helped destroy the Kido Butai, barely registered against the scale of Japanese defeat. Meanwhile, heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma had attempted to bombard Midway on the night of June 4th. They collided while avoiding submarine attack. American aircraft found them on June 6th. Mikuma was sunk with 700 hands. This was the highest death toll of any Japanese ship at Midway. Mogami, heavily damaged and with 92 dead, barely made it back to Truk. Her survival was considered miraculous. The disaster was complete and total. The journey home was one of shame and silence. Wounded sailors from the carriers were kept isolated in special compartments. No one was allowed to speak of what happened. Orders were strict and absolute. The defeat must remain secret. When the fleet returned to Japan at Hashirajima Naval Base on June 14th, they anchored at night. Darkness hid their shame from watching eyes. The wounded were offloaded in darkness. They were classified as secret patients. Special trucks took them to isolated naval hospitals. There they were kept under virtual arrest. Quarantine separated them even from their own families. They were forbidden any contact with the outside world. According to U.S. Naval Institute sources, they were treated in an appalling manner. They were considered disgraced losers who had failed the emperor. The survivors of the air groups were immediately reassigned. They went to distant bases in the South Pacific without being allowed to see families or friends. The majority would die in subsequent battles of the Solomon Islands campaign. Their knowledge died with them in jungle airstrips. The carrier crews were dispersed to different ships and bases. They were sworn to secrecy under threat of severe punishment. Speaking of defeat meant court-martial. The systematic cover-up began immediately upon return to Japan. The government prepared its propaganda version of events. Truth was the first casualty. The sunken carriers Kaga and Soryu remained on the official roster. They were listed as unnamed to maintain the fiction they still existed. No flag officers were court-martialed or even officially reprimanded. This would require admitting defeat had occurred at all. Information about the defeat was withheld from the Imperial Japanese Army for a full month. Even senior generals were kept ignorant. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo was kept in the dark about the full extent of the disaster. Only the Navy's highest leadership knew the truth. On June 5th, while the ship still burned on the ocean floor, Tokyo Radio announced to the Japanese people different news entirely. Naval and air forces of the Empire have succeeded in inflicting heavy damage on American fleet and air forces in the Central Pacific. Later broadcasts added more fictional victories. Japan had achieved another smashing victory, with 2 American carriers sunk and heavy damage to others. The lies would continue for years. The truth would remain buried like the ships themselves. The Tokyo press barely whispered the truth in those first days. Almost as an afterthought, they mentioned losing 1 carrier. The word cargo slipped into reports like a secret code. Real losses stayed buried behind official silence. Street celebrations erupted across Japan. Citizens danced and cheered. They waved flags in summer heat. Their joy echoed off concrete buildings. None knew they celebrated their own doom. Days passed in manufactured triumph. Radio broadcasts painted glorious victory. Newspapers printed heroic headlines. The lies spread like wildfire through every prefecture. Truth remained locked in military vaults. June 10th brought the first cracks. The press hinted at difficulties in vague terms. Words danced around reality. Editors chose phrases carefully. Still, they maintained the fiction. Victory remained the official story. Commander Fuchida lay in his hospital bed. White sheets covered burns across his body. Bandages wrapped around his torso. The appendectomy had saved his life. The carrier explosion had nearly taken it. A naval intelligence officer appeared beside his bed. The man's uniform was crisp. His face showed no emotion. His eyes held steel. The warning came in measured tones. "You are forbidden to speak of what happened." The officer's voice cut through hospital silence. Other patients pretended not to listen. Nurses continued their rounds. The weight of official secrecy filled the room. "As far as the world knows, we won a great victory." Fuchida's response came wrapped in bitter irony. His words dripped with the futility he felt. Building wars on lies seemed pointless now. Though this exchange cannot be verified independently, the sentiment rang true. Admiral Yamamoto retreated to his cabin aboard Yamato. The massive battleship swayed gently at anchor. Steel walls enclosed his private torment. 3 days passed without his appearance. His staff heard footsteps pacing overhead, back and forth through the night. Sleep eluded their commander. Failure tortured his mind. The sound of his boots on steel deck became a rhythm of regret. In his private diary, thoughts poured out, words that would stay hidden until war's end. Staff officers who served nearby noticed his depression. It settled over him like thick fog. His prediction to Prime Minister Konoye now seemed prophetic. Japan had indeed run wild for exactly 6 months. The timeline matched perfectly. Pearl Harbor to Midway. December to June. 6 months of victories followed by devastating defeat. The timing felt almost supernatural. Exactly at the 6-month mark, the tide turned. Fortune's wheel spun completely around. Japanese expansion died at the same moment it reached its peak. Captain Kuroshima documented a private meeting. His notes captured Yamamoto's brutal honesty. The admiral's words cut like sword blades through the cabin air. "I gambled and lost." The admission hung heavy in the room. Senior officers shifted uncomfortably. Maps of the Pacific covered every surface. Red pins marked Japanese conquests. Black pins showed where dreams died. "In trying to destroy the American carriers, I have lost our own." His voice carried the weight of empire. 4 carriers rested on the ocean floor. Hundreds of pilots would never return home. The mathematics of war had shifted permanently. "The war is not lost yet, but I fear I have lost the means to win it." To his close friend, Rear Admiral Takeichi Hori, he wrote letters. These survived the war's destruction. His handwriting revealed inner turmoil. Ink blots marked moments of hesitation. The defeat at Midway was not bad luck. His analysis cut deeper than surface explanations. Enemy superiority in numbers wasn't the cause. Something more fundamental had failed. It was the result of our own overconfidence and poor planning. The words stung with self-recognition. Japanese commanders had walked into their own trap. Pride had blinded them to reality. We underestimated American capabilities and overestimated our own. The balance of war had tilted. What seemed like strength became weakness. What appeared as enemy weakness proved devastating strength. Now, we will pay the price for our hubris. His prediction followed with chilling accuracy. 18 months seemed optimistic. Actually, events moved faster than even his pessimistic calculations suggested. Within those 18 months, the Marianas would fall. American B-29 bombers would reach Japanese skies. Cities would burn under massive air raids. The cost of Midway stretched far beyond 4 carriers. Beyond the 357 dead whose bodies sank into Pacific depths, hidden losses cut much deeper. Over 100 of Japan's finest pilots perished. These men carried years of training, combat experience from China to the Indian Ocean. Their knowledge died with them. The pilot training program demanded 2 years minimum. Creating experts took much longer. The production line of skilled aviators had snapped. Replacement would take years Japan didn't have. More devastating still, over 700 skilled aircraft mechanics died. Armorer expertise vanished beneath the waves. Flight deck crews with decades of knowledge were gone forever. These men knew every rivet in their aircraft, every quirk of carrier operations. Their institutional memory disappeared in minutes. Books couldn't replace such hands-on wisdom. Admiral Ugaki captured the tragedy in his diary. American forces later translated these captured pages. His words revealed the true scope of loss. We can build new carriers in 2 years. Steel and machinery could be manufactured. Shipyards could work around the clock. Industrial capacity remained intact for now. We cannot build new pilots with the experience of those we lost. Human expertise required time and training. Years of development couldn't be rushed. Combat veterans needed actual combat to develop their skills. We will never replace the skilled maintenance crews. These specialists knew how to keep aircraft flying under combat conditions. Their tricks and techniques died with them. Future maintenance would never reach the same level. The real tragedy of Midway is not the ships, but the men. Ships were replaceable. Men were not. Japanese naval aviation never recovered from these human losses. 2 years later, the Battle of the Philippine Sea proved this point. June 1944 brought inexperienced Japanese pilots into combat. They faced veteran Americans in superior aircraft. The massacre was complete. Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 600 Japanese planes were lost. Minimal damage was inflicted in return. The seeds of that disaster were planted in Midway's waters. The experienced pilots who died there might have made the difference. Instead, boys flew against men. Midway marked the absolute end of Japanese expansion. Within Imperial General Headquarters, reality slowly penetrated official optimism. Despite the propaganda, truth seeped through. Planned invasions were quietly cancelled. Fiji would remain in Allied hands. Samoa stayed beyond Japanese reach. The Hawaiian invasion became impossible fantasy. Operation FS faced immediate abandonment. The supply lines between America and Australia would remain open. Japanese forces couldn't cut this vital connection. Instead of offense, Japan faced defensive war. This was a war they couldn't possibly win. Industrial capacity favored America overwhelmingly. American confidence soared after Midway. Planning for counteroffensive began immediately. Guadalcanal lay just 2 months in the future. The long, bloody advance toward Japan would start there. The psychological impact cut deeper than material losses. Japanese naval invincibility had been carefully cultivated since 1905. The victory over Russia at Tsushima had created this myth. Now it shattered completely. Commander Tamaichi Hara recalled this transformation in his post-war memoirs. His words captured the changed atmosphere. After Midway, we never felt confident again. Doubt crept into every decision. Second-guessing replaced bold action. The psychological edge had shifted permanently to America. We went into battle expecting to lose. This expectation became self-fulfilling prophecy. Defeatist attitudes infected operations. Commanders planned for failure rather than success. The Americans went in expecting to win. Confidence bred more confidence. Success seemed inevitable to American forces. They approached each battle with aggressive optimism. The whole psychology of the war had changed. Those 5 minutes when carriers burned transformed everything. Naval warfare psychology flipped completely. The hunted became the hunters. Within the Japanese Navy, Bitter recriminations began immediately. Public blame was impossible under military culture. Private accusations flew like arrows. Admiral Nagumo became the perfect scapegoat. Despite following orthodox doctrine perfectly, he bore responsibility for defeat. His career was finished. Shore duty replaced fleet command. He would never lead carriers again. In 1944, during the American invasion of Saipan, he commanded ground forces instead. Rather than face capture, he committed suicide. The warrior's code demanded death over dishonor. His final act followed centuries of tradition. Admiral Ugaki wrote harsh judgment in his diary. His words reflected the need for someone to blame officially. Nagumo is finished as a commander. The verdict was final. No appeal existed in military hierarchy. Someone had to fall for this disaster. The blame must fall on someone, and it cannot be Yamamoto. The architect of Pearl Harbor remained too important. His strategic genius was still needed. Lower ranks would pay the price instead. Midway also exposed fundamental flaws in Japanese military culture. Rigid thinking had contributed to disaster. Inability to adapt when situations changed proved fatal. Blind adherence to doctrine despite changing circumstances showed dangerous inflexibility. All these cultural traits were recognized but couldn't be changed overnight. The same rigid hierarchy that led to Midway's disaster would repeat throughout the war. Cultural patterns proved impossible to break under pressure. Post-war analysis revealed cascading failures that guaranteed disaster. Each mistake built upon previous errors. The operation was doomed from conception. Japanese forces were scattered across thousands of miles. They couldn't support each other effectively. Coordination became impossible across such distances. Radio silence was maintained religiously. This prevented any coordination when plans went wrong. Flexibility was sacrificed for operational security. Intelligence was absolutely dismal. Japanese commanders had no idea American carriers were already at sea. Meanwhile, Americans knew every detail of Japanese plans. Code-breaking gave Americans decisive advantage. They read Japanese messages as quickly as intended recipients. This intelligence gap proved insurmountable. The failure of reconnaissance was particularly damning. Only 7 search planes covered vast ocean areas. Americans deployed over 30 PBY Catalinas for the same mission. Operation K reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor was canceled. American presence at French frigate shoals forced this decision. Yamamoto lost his eyes just when he needed them most. The submarine cordon arrived too late. American carriers had already left Pearl Harbor. They slipped through undetected while submarines were still moving into position. The Tone's crucial 30-minute delay in launching its scout plane proved fatal. That single aircraft might have detected American carriers. Instead, it launched late and missed them completely. Each failure individually might have been overcome. Together, they guaranteed complete disaster. The Americans held every advantage that mattered. Most critically, Japanese leaders underestimated American capabilities while overestimating their own. They assumed Americans couldn't break their codes. They had broken them completely. They assumed Yorktown couldn't be repaired quickly after Coral Sea damage. She was fixed in just 72 hours through heroic dockyard efforts. They assumed American pilots were inferior to Japanese veterans. At Midway, American dive bomber pilots proved devastatingly effective. They assumed American carriers would arrive after Midway was captured. Instead, they were waiting in perfect ambush position. Damage control failures proved equally revealing. Japanese carriers had closed hangar decks and inadequate firefighting systems. They became death traps when hit by bombs. American carriers featured open hangar decks and superior damage control procedures. They proved far more survivable under combat conditions. Yorktown absorbed tremendous punishment and might have survived. Only the submarine attack finally sank her. Japanese carriers burned catastrophically from single bomb hits. Poor fuel system design made fires spread rapidly. Inadequate ammunition handling procedures caused explosive chain reactions. American carriers were built to survive damage. Admiral Yamamoto didn't long survive the defeat he knew had doomed Japan. On April 18, 1943, American codebreakers intercepted his travel schedule. P-38. Lightning fighters intercepted his plane over Bougainville. They shot it down in flames over Jungle Canopy. His death came exactly 1 year after Doolittle's raid. Found in the jungle, still strapped to his seat, sword at his side, Yamamoto carried full knowledge of how Japan lost the war. Those 5 minutes at Midway had sealed the Empire's fate. Before his death, in one of his last surviving letters, Yamamoto reflected with remarkable clarity. His words showed deep understanding of what had gone wrong. At Midway, we learned that wars are not won by spiritual strength alone. The lesson came at terrible cost. Yamato's spirit couldn't overcome material disadvantage. Courage without intelligence led to disaster. They are won by intelligence, both kinds. Good information was essential. The wisdom to use it properly was equally important. Japan had possessed neither advantage. We had neither. The admission was brutally honest. Intelligence gathering had failed completely. Strategic wisdom was lacking at crucial moments. We were too proud to believe the Americans could be waiting for us. Pride had blinded Japanese commanders to obvious possibilities. They couldn't imagine enemies being so well prepared. Too rigid to adapt when our plans went wrong. When circumstances changed, Japanese doctrine couldn't bend. Flexibility was sacrificed for orthodox procedures. Too arrogant to admit our codes might be broken. Security assumptions proved fatally wrong. Americans were reading every message while Japanese remained unaware. Pride goeth before a fall, and our pride was limitless. Biblical wisdom applied perfectly to military disaster. Unlimited pride led to unlimited fall. The result was inevitable. Looking back, defeat seemed predetermined. Every factor pointed toward Japanese disaster once the battle began. The greatest irony of Midway was achieving Yamamoto's goal in reverse. It was indeed the decisive battle he had sought relentlessly. But Japan, not America, suffered decisive defeat. The carriers he tried to trap had trapped him instead. His planned ambush became his suffered ambush. The decisive battle doctrine that Japanese naval strategy had followed for 40 years proved correct. Americans simply won the decisive battle, instead of losing it. As documented in Japanese military archives, Yamamoto had genuinely feared American industrial might. In early 1942, he told his staff prophetic words. A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. Pearl Harbor's success brought more shame than pride to thoughtful commanders. Attacking without warning seemed dishonorable to traditional warriors. It is more a matter of shame simply for the one smitten. The victim deserved sympathy, not the attacker credit. True victory required facing alert and prepared enemies. I would rather you made your appraisal after seeing what the enemy does. American response would reveal their true character. Initial surprise attack proved nothing about relative strength. Since it is certain that angered and outraged, he will soon launch a determined counterattack. Yamamoto predicted American reaction perfectly. The sleeping giant would awaken with terrible fury. That counterattack would be devastating. At Midway, that counterattack arrived with crushing efficiency. Americans had not only recovered from Pearl Harbor trauma, they had turned Japanese strategy completely against them. The war continued for 3 more years after Midway, but its outcome was effectively decided in those 5 minutes. Everything afterward was just working out the inevitable conclusion. Beyond strategic implications, Midway was fundamentally human tragedy. In waters 325 miles northwest of Midway, 357 Japanese sailors and airmen died horribly. These were young men who had written final letters that morning. They had shared rice and tea for breakfast. Dreams of victory and home filled their minds. They died in flames that reached 1,000 degrees. Others drowned in oil-slicked waters. Explosions tore some apart instantly. The sounds could be heard miles away. Lieutenant Hashimoto survived from one carrier's engine room. His testimony at post-war investigations revealed the horror below decks. The screams of burning men echo in my nightmares still. The sounds haunted survivors for decades. No amount of time could erase those memories. Professional counseling didn't exist for such trauma. We couldn't save them. Rescue attempts failed completely. Fire blocked every passage. Heat melted steel ladders. Smoke choked potential rescuers. The passages were blocked by fire. The ladders melted from heat. Infrastructure collapsed under extreme temperatures. Escape routes vanished as metal superstructure failed. Men were trapped with no way out. We could only listen as they died. Helpless survivors heard everything. Voices calling for mothers, desperate pleas for water, final prayers to ancestral spirits. Their voices calling for their mothers, for water, for death to end their agony. The progression from hope to despair to death wish was heartbreaking. Young men faced deaths beyond human endurance. Every night I hear them still. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't understood then. Survivors carried psychological wounds for life. Sleep became impossible without nightmares. Families back home never learned the truth during wartime. Official notices claimed their sons died gloriously for the emperor. Great victory was the only story they heard. Mothers hung gold stars in their windows. Pride filled their hearts for such noble sacrifice. None knew it was for defeat that sealed Japan's fate. Truth only emerged after war's end. Betrayal was added to grief. Many families refused to believe even then. Official deception had been too complete. Petty Officer Tanaka survived Soryu's sinking. He recalled the morning before battle with painful clarity. Confidence had filled every sailor's heart. We were so confident. Victory seemed absolutely certain. American forces would be caught by surprise. The trap would spring perfectly. We joked about which American ship we would sink. Competition existed among the crew. Everyone wanted the biggest target. Bragging rights were already being claimed. Yamada said he would sink a battleship. The 18-year-old dreamed of glory. His family would be so proud. His name would live forever in naval history. Suzuki claimed he would shoot down 5 American planes. Another boy with similar dreams. 5 kills would make him an ace. Heroes would welcome him home. They were both 18 years old. Children playing at war games. Their innocence was heartbreaking in retrospect. Neither understood what death really meant. Both died when the bombs hit. Dreams ended in instant violence. No glory accompanied their deaths. Only fire and water and terrible pain. Their bodies were never recovered. The ocean kept its victims. Families had no graves to visit. Memorial services honored empty coffins. Sometimes I wonder if they're still down there. The survivor's guilt was overwhelming. Why had he lived when others died? The question tormented him forever. Standing at their posts, waiting for orders that will never come. Duty extended beyond death in his imagination. Faithful sailors serving eternal watch. The poetry of grief made memory bearable. Today, the 4 Japanese carriers rest in over 17,000 feet of water. Their exact locations were only recently discovered by deep-sea explorer Robert Ballard and subsequent expeditions. They serve as war graves, monuments to the price of hubris and cost of war, sacred sites where hundreds of souls found their rest. Aircraft once launched from their decks to spread destruction across the Pacific now lie crumpled in hangar bays. Metal birds that will never fly again. Instruments of conquest became monuments to defeat. The bones of their crews remain at battle stations. eternal guardians of ships that will never sail again. Death had not released them from duty, they stand watch forever. From Japanese perspective, Midway represents the moment when dreams of empire collided catastrophically with reality. Spiritual strength alone couldn't overcome material weakness. Courage without intelligence led to disaster. Rigid thinking couldn't adapt to fluid situations. Japan kept its appointment with destiny, and destiny proved merciless. The Midway defeat shattered more than ships and lives. It shattered fundamental illusions that had driven Japanese expansion. Everything changed in those crucial minutes. The myth of Japanese invincibility died with the carriers. Faith in spiritual superiority over material strength became meaningless. Belief that determination could overcome any odds proved false. In their place came grim recognition. Japan had started a war it couldn't win. Against an enemy it had fatally underestimated, using strategies that modern warfare had rendered completely obsolete. Yet, from defeat's ashes came a different Japan, one that renounced war forever. Democracy was embraced completely. The nation became a force for peace and prosperity. The samurai spirit that once drove conquest now drives innovation. Discipline and dedication found new outlets. Competition moved from battlefield to marketplace. The nation that once sought to dominate the Pacific now helps maintain its peace. Military power transformed into economic strength. Former enemies became closest allies. Technological expertise that once built carriers now builds cars and computers. Engineering skills found peaceful applications. Innovation replaced conquest as national goal. In that complete transformation, perhaps the 357 who died at Midway didn't die entirely in vain. Their sacrifice contributed to Japan's rebirth as peaceful democracy. The battle stands as warning to all nations. Overconfidence and rigid thinking lead to disaster. No military force should consider itself invincible. The Japanese military, despite tactical brilliance and brave personnel, fell victim to its own success. Victory disease infected decision-making at every level of command. The assumption that what worked before will always work proved fatal. That enemies will act as expected was disastrous. That superior spirit will overcome material disadvantage was deadly illusion. The same Navy that brilliantly executed Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier now bungled basic reconnaissance. Intelligence warnings were ignored completely. They walked into an obvious trap. As we examine Midway from Japanese perspective, we see not villains, but human beings. Caught in war's terrible machinery. Young pilots flying to death with courage, if not wisdom. Commanders making decisions with incomplete information under impossible pressure. Mechanics working frantically to prepare aircraft they'd never see again. Sailors fighting uncontrollable fires while staying at posts until the end. Their story deserves telling not to glorify defeat or war, but to remember the cost of military aggression, the price of imperial ambition, the human toll of strategic miscalculation. Lieutenant Commander Fuchida's post-war transformation, despite questions about his reliability, represents something essential. From Pearl Harbor architect to Christian evangelist, from warrior to peace advocate. His journey mirrors Japan's own transformation, from aggression to pacifism, from empire to democracy, from isolation to international cooperation. Though specific accounts need caution, the symbolism remains powerful. The lesson of Midway from Japanese perspective is ultimately universal. No nation can afford to underestimate enemies, overestimate capabilities, ignore warfare's changing realities. The same carriers that seemed invincible at Pearl Harbor proved fatally vulnerable at Midway. The same pilots who had swept all before them met their match. Strategies that worked against divided enemies failed against united, informed opponents. In the end, waters that closed over Japanese carriers were the same waters that would wash away the militarism that sent them there. Ocean depths claimed more than ships and men. The young men who died believed they fought for emperor and empire. They couldn't know they were dying for New Japan's birth, peaceful, prosperous, and democratic. Their sacrifice, though tactically meaningless and strategically disastrous, demonstrated military aggression's futility. Empire through force was impossible to sustain. Peace proved the only path forward. This is Midway from Japanese perspective. Pride before the fall. Human error compounding into catastrophe. Young lives sacrificed for strategic miscalculation. A story deserving telling not to celebrate defeat or victory, but to remember war's cost and empire's price. The waves that closed over Japanese carriers carried away more than steel and flesh. They carried away illusions of invincibility, dreams of conquest, the entire worldview that had driven Japanese expansion. In their place came wisdom bought with blood. The ghosts of Midway, Japanese and American alike, remind us that war brings no glory, only terror and tragedy. That peace, however difficult to maintain, always surpasses even the most decisive victory. In the vast Pacific, where carriers still rest in their deep graves, only eternal wave movement remains, carrying neither Japanese nor American voices, simply humanity's costliest lesson echoing through time. War, no matter who claims victory, leaves only loss in its wake. The price paid at Midway teaches us that conquest brings only destruction. Peace, however fragile, remains humanity's greatest achievement.